Started monitoring the controversial live export trade at Ramsgate port last month. It's the first time the charity's done this in a UK port for a decade. Ramsgate is the only one in the country that transports livestock for slaughter across the channel. Animal rights campaigners say the practice is cruel and unnecessary, but they haven't stopped tens of thousands of sheep and calves being shipped from there to Europe in the past year. Is this a case of human profit over animal welfare? Helen Drew has this report.
The emotional reaction to live animal exports from Ramsgate port.
5 more hours in a barge!
Every time the livestock lorries arrive, there's a protest here. It's the only port in England that exports live animals for slaughter, and around 80,000 left the country this way last year. The animals are mainly sheep and calves on their way to the continent.
Everybody that's down there can carry these and wave them.
Campaigners, including Kent Action Against Live Exports, say this is cruel to the animals, as it means they're being crammed in for very long journeys, for more time than it would take to drive from Kent to Scotland.
Let's say a farmer from Kent wishes to send some animals across. He then has to load his transporter, move to an area very, very close to the dock, where they have to have a minimum of an hour's rest while they're inspected. They then board the Jolene, which sails from Ramsgate, and takes 4.5 hours to get to Calais. They are then unloaded, and the nearest slaughterhouse, abattoir, is an hour and a half away. So we're already talking of a journey time approximately 8 hours plus, and that's just for slaughter. Animals going anywhere else, down to Spain, obviously have considerably more time on the wagon.
How long can those journeys take?
Well, look, the journeys can take 2 or 3 days.
In the last few weeks, the RSPCA has taken matters into its own hands and is monitoring every live export. It's the first time in 10 years that the charity has done this at a UK port. It doesn't have the power to stop the trade, so the best it can hope for is to get enough evidence to prosecute exporters if they aren't treating the animals properly.
All of the legislation and the rules are compliant on being enforced, and we know that they're not being enforced. Our own investigations and our own spot checks here in Ramsgate have shown that some of the standards are not being implemented, and that's a real concern.
The animals are often slaughtered soon after their journey, which campaigners say is needless because they could be killed over here and then shipped abroad, causing less suffering. But the way food is labelled abroad means this isn't happening.
French people in particular like French sheep, but there is a huge loophole at the moment in the legislation, because if your sheep is in France just for a small amount of time, it could be labelled as a produce of France.
It's Thanet District Council that owns the port, and whilst it's against the trade, the 19th Century Harbours Act means it had no choice but to accept it. But the council isn't going to make the exporters' lives easy.
Within this framework of the law, we are hoping that by exposing the infringements to the welfare of animals, that it is going to make the trade more and more difficult to operate out of the port of Ramsgate. There is plenty of scope still within the law to make it difficult for the shipments to take place.
Some farmers say they need to send the animals abroad for slaughter to get the highest possible price. But the RSPCA thinks there's a market for the meat here, which would also generate jobs.
If we keep those animals, whether they're sheep or calves, in this country, then we've got a market for them. The farmer is being paid. We're sending those through the abattoir. The slaughtermen are being paid. Surely it's far better for a British animal to be kept in Britain and then turned into good British food to be consumed by consumers. We know the consumers, the public, want to buy British, so surely we should give them that opportunity.
So is it necessary for British sheep and calves to go on journeys that it's said can last for days, when instead they could be slaughtered in this country, providing more local jobs and local produce?
That was Helen Drew reporting. Now, from our studio in Birmingham, we're joined by Peter Garbett from the National Farmers Union. I'd like to ask you, first of all, why is this trade necessary, Peter?
As your report said, this is a legitimate and it's a lawful trade. The market exists in the continent. People want to buy English stock in a British stock over there, and as long as the transport takes place within the law, following the tight regulatory guidelines that we all have to follow, then there's no reason that our farmers shouldn't be allowed access to that market.
And you said it's lawful, you say it's within the law, but we heard there from RSPCA inspectors who said they're really concerned that the rules, the guidelines aren't being followed.
Well, the NFU's always called for fair standard of the fair enforcement of the standards in Europe. We want there to be no loopholes that people can get through. We've seen 2 revisions of the legislation within the last 10 years, and we want those standards to be abided by.
So you welcome the RSPCA inspectors' presence at Ramsgate, do you?
The RSPCA are there at Ramsgate to ensure that all of the standards have been met, and I don't think that any shipments have been stopped by their presence.
No,
so
but they
I take
can't,
from that
I'm sure you know, I don't think they
people are
can.
adhering to the guidelines.
They can't stop shipments, but they can raise concerns, which they've just done. As I said, DEFRA issued a warning in March. Hauliers obviously aren't sticking to the rules, and that surely is a cause for concern for your members.
We do have a high level of scrutiny at Ramsgate at the moment, and still the exports are still going out from there.
So you don't think there's a problem? You don't think there are? Do you think the RSPCA are wrong to raise these concerns about lack of ventilation, about the way the animals are being handled?
Not at all. We have very firm guidelines and standards that we need to adhere to.
They're not being adhered to, according to the RSPCA.
If they're not being adhered to, then we would expect the animal health officers there who are employed by the government to be bringing prosecution notices, and that's not occurring. So they are being adhered to, and the trade's legitimate and lawful, and we expect it to continue.
The thing is, people don't like it. It might be lawful. The idea of animals being cooped up for 8 hours in high temperatures without being able to lie down, get to food or water, it's not nice, is it?
It's. I can understand that people's opinions of this trade aren't favourable, and we need to listen to public opinion. But as with all welfare rules, we need to base them on very sound science. There's been a lot of scientific studies conducted when the legislation was first drawn up and since the legislation, and none of them have suggested that overseas travel is in any way a detriment to cattle or sheep welfare, and none of them have suggested a limit on total transport length.
And in a word, Mr. Garbutt, if we could sell all that produce in France, not have to export these animals for slaughter, would you like that to be the case?
It would be great to boost our exports on the hook, but there'll always be a market on the hoof for them in the continent. We produce some very good cattle and sheep, and they are in demand by farmers in Europe.
OK, it makes economic sense. Well, Keith Taylor, Stephen Lloyd, you're both opposed to live animal experts. You're on record as being opposed. But, Keith Taylor, these farmers are within the rules, whether the animals are travelling on water or over road. They're allowed to do this, aren't they?
Yeah, I think I take issue with a couple of things that Peter said. Firstly, about the stress experienced by the animals. I was talking only yesterday to the European Veterinary Association, who were explaining the levels of stress can actually induce a decrease in immunity to disease, which is called shipping fever.
Is there any difference, though, Stephen Lloyd, to being on a boat or being on land? If the animals are in transit for 8 hours, they're in transit for 8 hours by road or ship?
I'm sure I'm probably not hugely different, but I'm not happy with the whole trade, and I've been on record at signing an early day motion. I've also written to Jim Pace, the agriculture
Animals travel
minister.
for 8 hours on the road in this country, quite lawfully, so...
Well, they do.
You're not against that?
But no, I'm not, because it's a reality that we have to face. But I think the sea journey, what concerns me is what the RSPCA say. They're an incredibly respected organisation. If they say they're not entirely happy that all the rules are being adhered to, then I share that unease.
I think just on the point of accuracy, I mean, the European Parliament has voted its position to say there should be a maximum 8-hour limit. But what we're seeing in Europe is vehicles 24, 36 hours. This is wrong. This is not popular. This is in the top 3 of my postbag complaints.
Right.
It is not worth doing simply for a very small number of farmers to make £15 more profit.
Let's quickly put that point to Peter Garbutt. It's not worth doing, Peter Garbutt.
Well, I think there's actually quite a large European trade on this. There's a lot of over 8-hour transport in the EU due to the sheer size of the EU. And the Commission recently reviewed the latest regulation and decided not to impose a maximum 8-hour limit. They did say, though, there needs to be better enforcement across Europe, and we would be thoroughly 100% behind that and hope that our elected representatives would be as well.
OK, time's up, gentlemen. I'm afraid. Peter Garbutt from the NFU in Birmingham, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, this Thursday, the residents of Hastings, Crawley, Tunbridge Wells, Maidstone and Tandridge will be casting their votes in